only 15 inches. Not meters, not feet, just 15 inches before everything changes. In Cheboygan, the water is rising hour by hour, moving closer to what officials call the evacuation trigger. It sounds small, almost insignificant. But behind that number is a system already set in motion. At 12 inches, residents begin to prepare. At 6 inches, they get ready to leave. And at just 1 inch, evacuation orders are issued. It feels structured, predictable, controlled. But this time it is not that simple, because the water is not just rising, it is rising inside a system that is not fully operating. A critical part of the infrastructure, the one designed to move more water out, is still offline, and that changes everything. That 15-inch margin no longer means what people think it means. This is not just another spring flood, this is pressure building, time running, and a safety margin quietly disappearing. Subscribe now to stay updated on this unfolding situation and understand what is really happening behind the numbers. From a distance, it looked like a familiar pattern. Spring arrives, snow melts, rain follows, rivers rise. But this time, something felt different. Across northern Michigan, days of steady rainfall, combined with rapid snowmelt, pushed water levels higher than expected. Not in sudden bursts, but in a slow, relentless climb. The kind that doesn't shock you at first, until it's already too late to ignore. Emergency operations were activated. Crews moved quickly. Sandbags stacked along vulnerable edges. Pumps running non-stop, debris cleared from waterways. Gates carefully adjusted to manage the flow. Officials issued warnings repeating the same message: the situation was serious. And still, the water kept rising. Upstream lakes and rivers continued feeding into the system. Areas like Mullet Lake, Burt Lake, and surrounding waterways were already under pressure, sending more water downstream with nowhere else to go. The ground already saturated could not absorb any more. Every additional drop simply added to the load. In some locations, the impact was already visible. Flooded infrastructure, water creeping into communities, transportation disrupted, and forecasts showed that the inflow was not over yet. This was no longer a short-term surge. This was a system filling faster than it could release. And the most critical question was no longer how much water had already arrived, but how much more was still on the way. To understand the risk, you have to understand the system. A dam like Cheboygan is not just a wall holding back water. It is a controlled system built around one core function: balance. Water flows in, and water must flow out at nearly the same rate. That balance is maintained through multiple components working together: gates, spillways, and most importantly, the hydroelectric generation station. Under normal conditions, the process is straightforward. As water levels rise, operators adjust the gates and increase outflow. The hydro station adds another layer of capacity, pulling water through turbines and effectively increasing how much water the system can release. It is not just about producing power, it is about moving volume. When everything is operating at full capacity, the system can respond dynamically. Rising inflow is matched with increased outflow. Pressure builds, but it is managed. But that balance depends on one critical assumption: that every part of the system is working. Because the moment one component drops out, the entire equation changes. The inflow does not slow down. The water does not wait. But the system's ability to respond becomes limited. And in a situation where every inch matters, even a small reduction in outflow capacity can have a cascading effect. This is where the difference between designed capacity and actual capacity becomes dangerously real. Because on paper, the system still looks capable. In reality, it may already be falling behind. This is where the situation turns. Because at Cheboygan, the system is not operating the way it was designed to. The hydroelectric generation station, the component that can significantly increase outflow, is not running. Some water is still moving through bypass valves. But bypass flow is not the same as full operational capacity. It is a partial release in a moment that demands maximum output. Officials have stated that they are pushing as much water through the system as possible, and that may be true under current conditions. But there is a critical distinction here. As much as possible does not mean as much as the system was built to handle. Those are two very different realities. Because the original safety margins, the ones tied to those evacuation thresholds, were established with a fully functioning system in mind. Gates, spillways, and hydroflow all working together. Now, one of those key elements is missing. Which means the numbers people hear, 12 inches, 6 inches, 1 inch, may still be the same, but what those numbers represent has changed. The margin is no longer behaving the way it was designed to behave, and that is what makes this dangerous. Because from the outside everything still looks controlled, protocols are in place, responses are active, crews are working, but underneath that surface the system is carrying more pressure than it should. And the gap between expectation and reality is getting smaller with every inch. What is happening at Cheboygan does not exist in isolation, it is part of something much larger. At nearly the same time, about 150 miles to the south, Tippy Dam was facing the opposite problem. Instead of holding water back, operators were forced to release high volumes downstream. The reservoir was filling too quickly and the only option left was to push that water out fast. Further east, along the Au River Mio Dam, also began opening its floodgates, sending additional flow downstream under its own set of warnings. 3 dam events. One state, less than 48 hours. They are not identical emergencies. Each system has its own design, its own limits, its own response. But together, they reveal something critical. Michigan's water control network is under simultaneous stress. Because all of these systems are connected, not always directly, but through the same weather pattern, the same saturated landscape, the same relentless inflow. When one dam holds, another must release. When one system reaches its limit, pressure shifts elsewhere. That is how a localized problem becomes a regional risk. And once multiple systems begin adjusting at the same time, the margin for error shrinks everywhere. This is no longer just about Cheboygan holding the line. It is about whether the entire network can absorb what is still coming. Because when pressure builds across multiple points at once, there is no single place left to relieve it. By this point, the scale of the situation was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. Flood warnings were extended across a wide region covering dozens of counties. Not just one river, not just one town, but an entire upstream network still feeding water into the system. The warning window stretched days ahead, signaling one critical fact: the inflow had not peaked yet. Upstream areas including Mullet Lake, Burt Lake, the Sturgeon River, and the Crooked River were all contributing to the load. These are not small, isolated channels. They are part of a broader watershed that drains slowly, especially after prolonged rainfall and rapid snowmelt. And the land itself was no longer helping. With soil already saturated, there was no absorption left. Every additional inch of rain became direct runoff. Every drop moved faster, pushing into rivers, into reservoirs, into the very system already under strain. The impacts were already visible. Infrastructure disruptions, flooded zones, even regional transport points reported water intrusion. These were not projections, they were early signals of a system reaching its limits. And yet, despite all of this, the most important number was not how high the water had already risen, it was how much more was still on the way. Because as long as upstream flow continues, the pressure does not stabilize. It compounds. And in a system already operating below full capacity, that compounding effect is where risk accelerates. At first glance, this looks like a simple equation. More water comes in, more water must go out. But in reality, there are 2 separate timelines unfolding at the same time. The first is the clock of nature. Rain falls when it falls. Snow melts when temperatures rise. Water moves downhill without delay, without negotiation. It does not pause. It does not wait for instructions. It simply keeps coming. The second is the clock of the system. Decisions must be made. Approvals coordinated, equipment brought online, processes followed. Even in an emergency, infrastructure does not instantly adapt. It responds within limits, technical, operational, and sometimes regulatory. And those 2 clocks do not move at the same speed. At Cheboygan, that gap is becoming visible. Water levels are rising in real time, while part of the system that could increase outflow remains offline, dependent on coordination and timing beyond immediate control. From the outside, the response appears active, and it is. Crews are working, gates are managed, warnings are issued. Nothing about the effort is superficial. But the deeper issue is not effort, it is synchronization. Because when inflow accelerates faster than response capacity can adjust, the system begins to lose alignment. And once that alignment slips, the margin that once looked stable starts to behave unpredictably. This is the hidden vulnerability of aging, complex infrastructure. Not just whether it can respond, but whether it can respond fast enough. Michigan has seen this kind of situation before. Not identical, but close enough to matter. In May 2020, the Edenville Dam failed after water levels rose far beyond what the system could handle. The eastern embankment gave way, releasing a massive surge downstream. Within hours, the Sanford Dam was overtopped. Around 10,000 people were forced to evacuate, and the damage reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Later investigations pointed to a critical issue: the system did not have enough capacity to safely pass extreme flood conditions. That detail matters, because what happened at Edenville was not just about heavy rain or rising water. It was about the gap between what the system was expected to handle and what it could actually handle under real conditions. Now, at Cheboygan, the concern is not that failure is inevitable. It is that a familiar pattern is emerging: rising inflow, known limitations in outflow capacity, and key decisions or capabilities that depend on timing. The comparison is uncomfortable but necessary, not because history repeats itself exactly, but because it often follows the same structure, and when that structure begins to appear again, ignoring it is no longer an option. Because the difference between a controlled emergency and a cascading failure is often defined long before anything breaks. At this point, the situation comes down to one question: what does that remaining margin really mean? The water is still rising, upstream flow has not stopped, and the system is still not operating at full capacity. On paper, the thresholds are clear: 12 inches, 6 inches, 1 inch, a structured response, a defined path. But those numbers were built on the assumption that every part of the system is functioning as intended. Right now, that assumption no longer fully holds. Which means the margin that appears to exist may not behave the way people expect. This is not about certainty of failure. It is about uncertainty of performance under pressure. Because when a system is pushed close to its limits, small differences begin to matter. A delay, a restriction, a component offline. Each factor reduces flexibility at the exact moment flexibility is needed most. And this is where the story stands. Not at the point of collapse, but at the edge of a narrowing window where conditions are changing faster than the system can fully respond. The water has not peaked, the pressure has not eased, and the margin is still shrinking. The question now is simply but critical. When that margin is tested, will it hold or will it reveal something deeper? Stay informed with real-time updates on critical events like this. Subscribe now so you don't miss the latest developments, deeper analysis and breaking insights as situations evolve. Turn on notifications and join a community that stays ahead of the story before it becomes headline news.